This episode was meant to be a one-episode analysis of Burkina Faso. Yet the history of the country from 1945 until the present day is so full, so devastatingly intriguing, and so politically and socially complex that to only do a single episode was not possible. This is clearly a subjective thing. For Escherou, the political activist and commentator who has so generously dedicated his time to leading me through the continent of Africa, and myself, the people who make up the short 80-year history demand a closer look. By the end of this episode, for those who did not know of him, you will become acquainted with the name Thomas Sankara. He is a character who we will talk about at greater length in episode 2 of Burkina Faso. One point to raise here. When doing my research, I came across websites that told a very different tale to the many I had read, and it seemed unnaturally incongruous. When I searched deeper, I found that all of the management and financial offices were based in colonial countries. It was interesting and educational to read that material too, but at least by that point I knew why the story had been maliciously altered. If after all these years empirical powers are still working against him, it tells you how great Sankara was. What there is to learn from Thomas Sankara should constitute the political curricula of every university in the world. Every politician should follow his lead. Every person should look at their own leaders and compare them with this great man. Thank you, Escherou, for your time. Turn the mic clocking out. Enjoy.
Dung weche pek kod welo mabiro etu under mic. Dung parodit kod jok mawuoye etu under mic. Seche tin sud buta wawinji etu under mic. Wola wachokre, wabed piny, biwawinje, ero chako, dungo mit ndi, podcast makende.
I'm joined for our third podcast on the continent that is Africa by Escherou. Escherou, how's it going?
Yeah, not too bad, not too bad. Thank you. Lovely to be here once again. I'm quite getting used to these weekly meetings. Yeah, can't complain. In good health. We're fighting off the flu last week, but I'm fighting fit this week.
Oh man, okay. Unfortunately you keep on managing to find a way. Well, fortunately you managed to find a way to triumph against adversity, but unfortunately you have to keep finding that damn way.
That's right.
But yeah, that seems to be the way of things. Yeah, I'm really happy to have you on the show again. And one of the things which kind of reassures me is that there is so much to talk about with regards to the continent of Africa. We could be here for years, my friend, and that I think is a positive thing, at least for me.
Absolutely. I think the continent is so vast. I think a lot of people never really think about it because the only time we ever hear all the Western narrative is, malnourished children living in, on dusty plains or mud huts. But I mean, there's a hell of a lot more to the continent than we are told.
Yeah, well, that would be Trump's approach. But also, I believe I'm listening to a fantastic book at the moment called The New Jim Crow.
Yes.
And there, I believe the author refers to G.W. Bush, who considers Africa to be a single nation, which is interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, yes, indeed. I've read the book, The New Jim Crow. It's by Dr. Michelle Alexander. And it talks heavily about the incarceration rates for Black Americans. Very, very, very good book. I do recommend people to read it or listen to it if it's available. But yes, he does indeed, and I think that's a problem when many people do talk about Africa. They talk about it as one single country. They don't realize that there's many different countries in Africa and many different cultures. I believe that the people in Africa, genetically speaking, of course, there's a larger difference between someone living in, let's say, in Niger and someone living in Nigeria on the other side than there is between you and I, for example.
Yeah, and I can't imagine how many languages are spoken across the continent of Africa. I think the comparative count would be far greater than the European count. But again, it's not a competition between one continent or another. What we're trying to get at is something completely different. And our journey has brought us to what was once considered French Upper Volta, but that's changed to Burkina Faso in 1984, I believe. You've been looking forward to this chat for a long time.
you make me sound like a professional here on Burkina Faso.
I could definitely say that you have been extremely excited to talk about Burkina Faso, and there are a number of reasons why. At least one of your heroes as a leader is a Burkinabe, but then there is also a more recent example that we will, I'm sure, get into, who also demands respect. But yeah, do you wanna quickly sort of introduce us why Burkina Faso is so interesting for you as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's take a look at the geography itself first. Okay, it's a landlocked country in West Africa. It covers an area of around 274,000 square kilometers. Landlocked, of course, as I just said, bordered between Mali in the northwest, Niger to the northeast, Benin to the southeast, Togo, and Ghana in the south. Also, not forgetting the Ivory Coast. Has a population of about 20 million. And very wealthy in terms of resources. It has gold. I believe it's the fourth largest gold producer on the African continent, followed by zinc, copper, magnesium, phosphate, limestone, diamonds, bauxite. Bauxite is the ore from which they extract aluminium, for those who are unsure, nickel, and vanadium. The country has had I would say, a very checkered past. Capital is a place called Ouagadougou, okay? And it is one of only 3 capitals with beginning with the letter O. Oslo, Ottawa are the other 2. Don't ask me how I know that. But yes.
There you go. Yeah, fantastic. What's interesting is that we both went into the kind of resource-rich elements when we discussed the Democratic Republic of Congo. But I didn't even have the time to get into the resources in the detail that you did. There is so much political upheaval in Burkina Faso. But I think the reasons for that is, well, we will come to it. But yeah, I don't know where to start, but I mean, you know, there's a lot of information online. Not all of it is necessarily accurate, but it's very interesting, the transfer from colonialism to then post-colonialism, the process that was undertaken, the journey that Burkina Faso took as Upper Volta. I think a lot of people have to look into that and this union of countries which came together after they decided to accept the new French constitution, but then to do so in their own way. There's a lot of political intrigue there, and I think not enough of it is actually talked about because there's a lot to learn.
Oh, absolutely. I think this story with Burkina Faso, or what was Upper Volta, isn't really unique. I think if you look at the country itself and its geographical location and what it has is what makes it an exciting place, or prize, if you will, for, I wouldn't just say colonial powers, but certainly those people or those individuals who are looking to profit from the country itself. But because of its geographic location and all the countries that it's bordered with, stability in the country is of utmost importance for those people that run those countries, because any civil unrest or any civil war, anything that may break out, will spread out into these countries. So of course, all these countries have to come together to ensure that there is a level of peace. And what you find is today, the strides that Ibrahim Traore is making within the country serves as beneficial for the countries that it surrounds, and this is why the support is there from her closer neighbors than those abroad who seek to exploit it.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, while you were talking there, and I'm very happy you mentioned the unification or the support as well of other African nations. When I was doing the research into this, what I found was that I easily slipped into the France narrative. There's a lot of
Yes,
information about post-war France and its rebuilding and General de Gaulle and so on and so forth. But then you fall into the exact kind of narrative which a French historian would want you to fall into. And I think it would be the most unfair thing for me, and then by connection, as it were, forcing you to then engage in basically retelling a European's perspective of what happened. So I want to kind of completely ignore that. Maybe you and I can talk about France in the post-war years and then consider what they did in that period from a slightly
okay,
alternative perspective. But for me, I'm not. I had written down a lot of stuff about that, and I'm just going to ignore it because I don't think it fits here today.
absolutely,
We're talking about Burkina Faso, and that should be the perspective that we take. If you agree with
absolutely.
that we can, yeah.
Absolutely, because I believe with African nations, I think you and I have spoken about before, or we both said that while post-colonial economic policies plague the continent, we forget what the people within the continent are trying to do. I mean, if you look at the Greta Thunberg, for example, she has become very much a champion and a voice for fighting against environmental disasters and ecological damage. But let's remember, there have been leaders in Africa and people in Africa that's been doing this for some time that have never been given that recognition. Thomas Sankara is one of these people, but we'll go into that in a short while.
There is some political intrigue which comes from France, and they did instigate, as it were, their attempt to try to maintain whatever hold that they could on certain African possessions. Unfortunately, that's the term that is used, but maybe we should actually use that term as well, because people should realize that was how European leaders considered African nations to be. It was a possession, and everything that involves. And they tried to extend that influence. They used every possible means that they could. I believe de Gaulle even entertained coming to or visiting Africa and going through many African states to try to gauge the sense of the people and so on. And I think the kind of movements that resulted from that visit, not every African state was happy to have him there. And I think the fact that some African leaders stood up against de Gaulle, like I believe Sekou Touré, who was the Guinean leader, and Guinea was the only country that rejected the French constitution, and then therefore automatically became independent. And the reason why I say this is because France tried to topple Touré twice, covertly.
Correct.
And this is something which we will address, I guess, when we talk about Guinea. But again, when the European powers or the West didn't get what they wanted, they sought different means of trying to attain that.
What we should also remember with the continent of Africa, the way that it takes hold of the way that the West manages to take hold of a lot of the continent is through its education systems. I mean, African leaders are known for sending their children to French-speaking schools if they're from French-speaking Africa. The English-speaking parts of Africa favor American or British universities, and it is there that their children meet the children of heads of states and leaders of big nations and organizations and companies across the globe. And it's how the exploitation keeps continuing. And this, it is part of the post-colonial policy that this is a thing. Instead of building a university of high standard in Africa and educating their children there, instead of manufacturing their own cars, they're buying Ferraris or Porsches, or instead of manufacturing their own clothes. I mean, these things are changing very slowly, but there's still a lot of external influence and external pressure stopping that from happening. But again, with brave leaders like we've seen in the past, Colonel Gaddafi, say what you like about him, but he did try to turn Africa in another direction. And of course, we have Sankara, which tried the very same thing. Kwame Nkrumah, as we've spoken about before, very briefly in Ghana, and of course, the new kid on the block, Ibrahim Traore.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned Gaddafi as well, because as you say, he does remain a controversial figure. There are a lot of people who point to, shall we say, there was a lot of killing done in his name, I believe, in Libya, and this should not be overlooked. And also, and I'm happy to obviously go against what I said earlier, to engage in conversation beyond Burkina Faso, in the sense that Gaddafi also plays a role in what happened to Sankara. Now, that role perhaps develops later on in Sankara's reign, but there is still something there. As much as we, and from what I've learned of Sankara, I can say deify with pure justification, because what the guy did was unbelievable. But he and Gaddafi did not see eye to eye in their politics, and that's also very interesting.
Absolutely, and I think we are humans, right? And Africa is a continent, as I said to you, that there are many different opinions, because people are different between the lines. He and Gaddafi didn't see eye to eye, but we're going back. Sankara died in 1987. We're going back a very long time. Had Sankara survived and met Gaddafi at a time when Gaddafi was thinking about bringing in the gold dinar, as he spoke about, and the African National Bank, he'd have aligned with Sankara. One could say that Sankara was way ahead of Gaddafi at that particular time, because most of what Gaddafi did was back then and throughout parts of the 90s. But then, of course, as he hit the early 21st century, his vision started to change for how he saw Africa. He started traveling and meeting Western leaders. I mean, we can see him with Obama, and pictures of him with Tony Blair, pictures of him with French prime ministers and presidents. And what he actually started doing was he started viewing the country. He started traveling and looking at studying democracies across different parts of the world. And he wanted to implement some kind of direct democracy in Libya, and then turn the country into something better than the rule it had. So I guess he became wise in his old age, if you will. And that's not discounting his past. That will always follow him. But he became wise in his old age. And I'm sure had Sankara lived, he and Gaddafi would have probably met somewhere in the middle at some point. But they had very opposing views. Not opposing views, but they had a difference of opinion at that point in time. It was just timing.
Because I obviously, we are both objective people and reflective, and so therefore would like people, when they listen, to realize that we are fully aware of the crimes that Gaddafi is accused of. Upper Volta, then, they, at the time of their, when it became the country that it did after the end of colonialism, relied a lot on, or had to rely on, international aid and provide labor, as it were, to the Ivory Coast's plantations to be able to sustain itself economically. That this is something which, if you're a child growing up with moderately wealthy parents, and then all of a sudden you go to university and your parents say, yeah, you're not going to get like regular money. You've got to do shit on your own. You've got to get your own job. You've got to do, it's a struggle. It is a struggle. Yeah,
absolutely.
And so therefore, when you have a vast territory which becomes an independent nation, which had no access to its own forms of independent bureaucracy, management, building, and so on, it is a challenge. And I imagine this is why the earlier leaders then pursued this policy of gaining international aid, because they didn't know better. And they wanted also to rely on their neighbors, in this case, the Ivory Coast. And the Ivory Coast said, yeah, if you want some benefit, then you got to do what we do. And it wasn't beneficial to Upper Volta, I think it's fair to say.
100% correct. I think when you have too much implementing the rule of one country to try and rule the country that you're living in, which has such a very different cultural, economic, political structure, is always going to be a challenge. It's very similar when we hear about the West bringing in regime change, and it always more or less fails, right? Because people have the structure and they've lived a certain way for centuries. To go in and expect them to change it over a couple of decades after shocking and awing them, it just doesn't work.
Eventually, things got to such a stage where on the 3rd of January 1966, the people launched a general strike, and the capital, Ouagadougou, became the center of the popular uprising. And the eventual beneficiary of this was Lieutenant Colonel Sangu Lamizana, who I believe became the president at that time. And he also had a relationship in some way with Sankara. So Sankara was like the beneficiary of this concept which Lamizana introduced to create scholarships for 3 people. And Sankara was such an ambitious and intelligent young person that he took the exam and he passed, and he very quickly became a rising star within the military. But here is the thing. It's not that this guy became this wonderful genius tactician and knew and learned how to kill people. What seems to have really inspired him was some of the teachers that he had, Adama Toure, the African Independence Party member, and they had somewhat progressive policies. Perhaps they leaned towards the left, somewhat communism and so on played a role in some of their ideology. But what I've also learned is that Sankara, when he traveled to Madagascar, and there was a group called the Green Berets, not the Green Berets that we know of, but these guys actually were social police. He learned that the military could actually play a positive role for the people if taught to do so specifically. So he was a very social military officer, if that can be said. Yeah,
absolutely. That makes sense. I think often when we see people in the military gear, we automatically assume that these people are looking for war. Thomas Sankara wasn't that way. But also, let's remember that he attended a parachute. Well, that's the English phrase, probably pronounced differently in French. Parachute Academy in France, and this is where he was exposed to even more left-wing ideologies. Again, he earned a lot of attention for his heroic performance at the border with Mali. So, used his position at that time to announce that war to be unjust and useless. So, here's a guy in uniform, left-wing ideals, with an idea for his country, telling the people that war is unjust and useless. Of course, people are going to listen to him.
And what's interesting is that, again, what you mentioned is that kind of falls in line with what I was referring to earlier with regards to de Gaulle, because one of de Gaulle's main goals was to put down any kind of communist or socialist ideology, despite the fact that without those individuals, there would have been very limited French resistance within the nation during Nazi occupation. So the very people that helped free France from Nazism, from the Vichy regime, were the ones that he wanted to ensure had no opportunity to power. And I think this is very indicative of the right, of conservatism, of capitalism, because it doesn't give the left its due.
No, what works for me, that doesn't work for thee, right? I think that's how the phrase goes, or not for you, but not for thee, or something to that effect. But I think this is definitely how it was. And if you look at the world in which we live in, the left always seems to get blamed for all the things that go wrong, whereas the right like to credit themselves for always everything that goes right. But if you look at the left, they're hardly in power for very long or make the large decisions. It's usually those on the right. So it's a bit of a 6 of one and a half dozen of the other.
Absolutely. And if I read correctly, that de Gaulle's cabinet after the First World War, when they had, I think in 1945, the first elections, the communists won the majority of seats in parliament, but they didn't get a single minister. And I think that's very indicative of the sense of democracy, which really is in play at the time.
Well, I mean, I still think that is very, very similar now. Very little has changed. I mean, we recently had elections in France. I think that Macron called them because he wanted to push off or stave off the right. It was a clever thing to do to get rid of Marine Le Pen. But the left got a 30% of the votes. But, he remained silent about it, never spoke about it, pushed it to one side. And then he put the Brexit negotiator in.
Michel
Barnier, to install him as part of the government, and that kind of shut the left up. So, yeah, it just shows you democracy yeah, thinly veiled, thinly veiled. Let's just leave it there.
Yeah. So yeah, the dispute you refer to, I've identified as Agacha Strip, and just the border dispute which Mali, and as you say, Sangha recognized that as being completely unnecessary. Yeah, but it did help to win him a certain amount of respect because he captured Malian soldiers as opposed to just summarily executing them.
Exactly that. But Sankara is a very special, very special person himself. I mean, he was born to Catholic parents. Okay, what made him quite unique was, and I'm going back to what we said at the beginning of the show, right? That he was one of these few leaders that wanted to fight, environmental degradation. Okay, when we talk about places in the Middle East and Africa here from the West, we always seem to talk about women's rights or how women have few rights in some of these countries. Sankara was one for wanting to empower women. He wasn't alone in that. Across Africa, and this is well known, pre-colonial times in Africa, women were central to the household and central to the structure of economy. Still today, when you travel parts of West Africa, they refer to women as boss lady. And I remember going through Ghana and going through Gambia, and I asked a couple of people, why do you refer them as a boss lady? I said, well, they're the ones that make the decisions. They decide what is and what isn't. Without them, we'd be nothing. And I've heard men tell me this in Africa. And if you look at Rwanda, Rwanda has the highest, I believe, the highest amount of female representation of parliament and anywhere in the world. It's number one, higher than anywhere else in the world. Now, there's a reason for that. When the men went off to fight during the ethnic cleansing, the women were left at home to take care of the families and take care of things. When the men returned, when everything ended, they wanted to control back, but the woman says, no, we've been running things while you've been gone, and we're still here. So they have the highest representation of females in the parliament. So, and again, pre-colonial times, the structures were there. When the British and the French and everybody decided they wanted a piece of Africa, that changed on its head. It flipped on its head, and women had to take a role very similar to how it was here in Britain during the 18 and the 1900s, where the women stayed at home and the men went out and won the bread or got the bread from family. He was also one of these people who wanted to increase access to education, healthcare. So he saw a vision for Burkina Faso.
Yep, absolutely. And indeed, he had this vision because of what he experienced in his lifetime. So we're kind of skipping through the early years of Sankara, but I would advise, if anybody has a chance, he really is a most fascinating character, and it really does, it would benefit anybody to learn about what inspired his development. But as you say, while Lamizana was in charge, and he was sent, and Lamizana respected Sankara, even though I believe he was aware that Sankara didn't approve of the way that he ran his government. But it must be said, Sankara was respected by the leader because he was given, or he was promoted constantly within the military under his presidency. So he was sent to the Po, where he was allowed or given the opportunity to manage his own force and his own academy. And he did many things while he was there. He realized some of the issues that were there in the area, in the Po, and he realized that there was fundamental change that was needed. And this is where perhaps he saw his role developing. So he noticed that less than 10% of people lived in cities. Adult literacy was 11%, and only 18% of kids attended primary school. And thereafter, 3% attended secondary school. And so that refers to the education which he wanted to bring in, which he did thereafter when he became president. And also it refers to the fact that he saw soil erosion, drought after drought, stagnating agricultural productivity. It left the nation poor, hungry, and malnourished. And this is a horrific statistic that I pulled up as well. The average life expectancy was 44. 44.
Yes. Correct. And let's remember that Sankara successfully implemented programs to reduce infant mortality rates, increase literacies in schools, but also boosted the amount of women that held governmental posts. I mean, this man really saw the vision to change the continent. I mean, 44 is very low, but he actually put in a system to improve that.
Yeah, I believe he introduced a program by which 2 million children were vaccinated. And this is extremely ambitious at the time. Everybody thought there's no way. What is the point? What can you possibly achieve with that policy? 2 million children vaccinated.
Absolutely.
2 million children given a chance to live and grow and contribute to the wealth and development of their country.
Absolutely. And these are the things about Africa that we don't hear. These are the stories that we never discuss. We never hear about them because it's always, I remember I remember posting a picture of Sankara, Ibrahim Traore, and I remember someone commented, why do they always walk around in a military uniform? And I went, well, why not? Why is the comment on his uniform? Look at what he's doing, have some, open your mind. But I guess when you're trained to think a specific way, very linear, then you continue along that line if you don't try to at least see what's going on to the left and right of you.
Yeah, but this is indeed one of the issues that we've got, I believe, in the West, our inability to identify what we see with what happens. So the reason why we, and I'm talking about here, your average white European, would look at perhaps some of these African nations being governed by people who wear military uniforms, we look at that and we take a judgment call, or we make a judgment to say, okay, these guys are aggressive. These guys have got military there in place to back them up the whole time. That's the only way they can rule. Because we ourselves identify military not with anything positive. We identify military with a final solution to a problem, killing, and don't take any shit. As in, if the military is called into a situation, civilian decision-making is out the window. It's now a military decision, and they don't screw
Absolutely.
around. And it's that tunnel vision which we don't realize. That is the Western role of the military. That is not necessarily the role of every military in other countries.
No, and I think that actually is a very good segue to the country itself. I mean, if you look at, it used to be called Upper Volta. The name was changed to Burkina Faso, which literally means upright people. Okay, and this is what Thomas Sankara wanted. He wanted a group of people that stood upright and that they were proud of who they are. Okay. Let's remember that a lot of the countries in Africa, I think I even tweeted yesterday, ever since, as far back as I can remember, ever since the age of consciousness, whenever I've looked around me, I've always seen people that look like me or very similar to me that have been under attack. And of course, these people have always been in defensive mode, so they've always had to take a position of defense. And this probably has a reason as to why they walk around and or feel the need to wear these uniforms. Let people know that we're ready, we're always ready.
Indeed. And then referring back to then the development of Sankara, so he sees within the government of the day that what is happening is wrong. However, there was a movement to remove Lamizana from office, and he didn't go with it. He was invited to participate in the coup, and he didn't go with it. He didn't want to be involved in that kind of episode. And I think that's really telling of the kind of person that he was. He probably knew he could have taken power at the time if he wanted to, but he resisted any kind of temptation to do so.
Well, let's remember, one of the things that he was primarily concerned with was fighting corruption within the country. He wanted that to go. If Sankara had decided to take the country by force, people probably would have respected him less. They would have probably said, he's just the same as before. So I think that him doing that was a strategic move in order to win the hearts and the minds of the people. They'd be far easier to convince of the plans that he had for the country, doing it the way he did. If he was parachuting into his seeds and they said, look, this is what we're going to do, he wouldn't have had the backing of the people.
Yep, indeed. And also another indicator, one I should have mentioned earlier before I mentioned that, the coup story, was that he was repeatedly invited to take up a post in Lamizana's government, but refused to do that too. He was finally convinced to become the Minister of Information, but that was only on the condition that his very good friend at the time, Compaore, who we will come back to for obvious reasons, would continue his work in the academy in Po, because he wanted to make sure that his work, as it was, along the principles that he had established, would continue and would not go back to somebody who would develop this Napoleonic system, which was in place when he first arrived. So this is quite important. And when he became the Minister of Information, he conducted it himself in a way which straight away showed how different he was. It distinguished him from the other ministers. He didn't want to use these huge European cars that would drive him around in luxurious fashion. He actually went to work with a bike. We've seen other politicians in the UK go to work by bike, haven't we?
Absolutely, absolutely. One we will not mention. I think he's been given too much airtime as he is, but yes.
Indeed. Yeah. But in the case of Sankara, I think there was a definite reason why he wanted to show that we don't, as ministers, have to have the best motor cars.
But this is humble. This is humility, right? Now, I remember when Mark Rutte was Prime Minister of the Netherlands, he rode his bike to work. When I lived in Sweden, politicians, you'd often see them walking or taking public transport to work. After all, they are supposed to be public servants, right? You go into office to try and improve life for the many, not the few, in a functioning democracy, or any country that functions. Unfortunately, it doesn't work like that in some so-called democracies.
Unfortunately, that is the case. But yes, indeed, you are right. Some people see public office being an opportunity to make money, as is the case in certain democracies. But other people take public office seriously. And these are the kind of people who very rarely rise to the highest office. In the case of Thomas Sankara, that wasn't the case. What I've also noted, and you were very obviously right to mention what you said, in his government, his cabinet of 86 to 87, he included 5 women. Ministers for Family Affairs, Culture and Health. These are not small ministries.
No. And this, I mean, if you look at the positions that he gave them, and this is for the well-being of society, right? I recently read a quote by the wife of Marcus Garvey. I can't remember word for word, so I'll say verbatim, it was something along the lines of, if men do not take care of the mothers, then they're in effect undoing themselves for later on in life. So women need to be taken care of for the benefit of society. It's just how it works.
Absolutely. There is absolutely no doubt whatsoever that is an absolute truth. And any nation which doesn't look after women within their society doesn't have much of a future. Yeah.
I found the quote. Let me just say it properly.
Please.
If the mothers of men are not treated fairly, men are but limiting their own progress and development. And that was Amy Jacques Garvey. And it's so true. In society, women, there needs to be a better representation across the board in order for society to feel healthy and for us to have well-being. And one of the things I certainly scream about living here in Britain, when I look at a representation of the current government, and of course the previous government, for me, it isn't just down to skin color, but we need people with real everyday values, people that have been on Civvy Street, that understand the struggle for many different groups of people. If the representation isn't there, society cannot be whole, ever.
Yep. And one other point which is relevant as well is in 2015, the United Nations released their 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And I have been told, and I am convinced, and I believe this to be the case as well, number 5, gender equality, is perhaps the most important goal. Without gender equality, it is simply unattainable to achieve a sustainable society. I completely agree with that.
Absolutely, 100%. I think that it's a must. It's a must. And we talk a lot. Again, there's a lot of hypocrisy, certainly where I'm living, when they all seem to point the finger at other countries for the treatment of women. But I think in Britain, 30% of all crimes committed in this country is violence against women and girls. I mean, 30% in a democracy that claims to be, of justice and truth and et cetera, it's a hell of a high number.
Definitely, absolutely, and the mentality starts early. It starts early in the system, at schools, in families, in organizations.
Absolutely.
Simply more has to be done. Yeah,
Absolutely,
cool.
absolutely.
Yeah.
100%. We need to work on that, because the violence against women is not good, and we need better representation for women and girls in all of our institutions and organizations across the globe.
Definitely. And they need to be seen not as objects. They need to be seen not as weak members of society that can be attacked with impunity. They need to be seen as people of equal standing. They need to be respected as people of equal standing in every way.
Absolutely. And even though I don't want to go off subject, I just think very quickly,
Yeah.
I'm sure people listening might have heard of Diane Abbott here in Britain. And there was a man called Frank Hester that said that he wanted to shoot her and hated all black women. Now, what really made me sad about all of that was all the apologists, first of all, a lot of very prominent women that stayed silent about that. Now, I'm not talking about I'm talking about women in general. There's a lot of prominent women, black and white, across the board, that stayed silent and never spoke out. And it's stuff like that that really makes me upset, because they should have all got together and called this out. So, yeah, we need to reframe and relook at the way we look at women and treat women in society in general.
Absolutely. And if anybody's a bit surprised about this slight detour that we've taken, I think it's fair to say, I don't want to speak with you in your voice, but I'm a very dedicated feminist. I get the feeling you are too.
Absolutely. Living in Sweden for 20 plus years does that to a person, but also having the right values from home.
Yep, absolutely. Cool. And yes. 100% woke as well. I'm happy to say that too.
Yes, yes, indeed.
So talking again about Sankara, you also mentioned about, you referred to Greta Thunberg and about how she is a beacon for environmental movement in the 2020s and a bit earlier too. But Sankara, he created a position called the Ministry of Water. I do not know a European nation that has a Ministry of Water. I know there is the Environment Ministry. But I kind of get the feeling that the environment is such a large sector, it's such a large topic. You cannot simply have a minister for the environment. And I have a feeling this is why so little is done. I think we need to have the Ministry of Environment split into areas, into ministries which cover the specific needs of each different part of the environment. Otherwise, they're not going to get the correct amount of funding. They're not going to get the correct amount of representation. And this is something that we can see being played out. None of the 17 goals that the United Nations set out in 2015 have actually been or will be reached by 2030. And I think one of the reasons why is because governments just do not take it seriously enough. Sankara took it extremely seriously. This was back in the 1980s.
I think it'd be fair to say that he was a Marxist-Leninist, right? Pan-African revolutionary. I think that'd be fair to say. People that have these left-thinking ideals tend to have a very different way in which they view the world. We are told to rubbish everything on the left, and communism's a bad thing, and and focus solely on neoliberalist principles. Thomas Sankara and other leaders across Africa, they realized the importance of environmental degradation, environmental breakdown. If you look at a lot of the problems that the environmental problems and catastrophes that we're facing, they're going to affect Africa first. A lot of people saw this happening right in front of their eyes, but as long as money was flowing, Western nations are not interested. And I would go as far as to say a lot of the principles that we're talking about here in Europe and the West about improving the environment have actually started in Africa some time ago. People started discussing these things. Of course, we had the very first climate conference in Sweden, I believe was it 1950s or the 1963, followed by another one 10 years later. And then we've had successive ones that have actually not led to anything. But Africa seems to be getting a lot worse, or the countries where that experiences a lot of warm weather seem to be getting worse. But because we're not there, we're not experiencing it, it's just a lot of lip service, and that's where really where the issue is.
Yep, and even today, I mean, we see, I believe COP29 this year is going to be in Baku, Azerbaijan, a genocidal petrostate. So, which is something you've seen me quite active on Twitter recently as well. So, that's exactly the sort of token gesture that the West approaches these topics with.
That's exactly what it is. They have to be seen to be doing something, but without actually doing anything at all. And then when you have the big oil and energy conglomerates who are backing these events like BP and Shell, for example, they're not doing it for the benefit of society. They're not looking for society to improve anyway. I mean, Rishi Sunak, one of the last things that he did before he left office was issue new licenses to the company to be able to drill for oil and gas in the North Sea, a company which his father-in-law had recently signed, God knows, 100 million or 200 million dollar contract with. I mean, that tells you everything about what they really think. They don't care because it doesn't affect them directly, and it's money for today and money for their kids to protect themselves in the future.
Well, what I find quite interesting is this. For some reason, there seems to be this kind of approach to similar contracts where if another government comes in, they cannot be cancelled, because if they are cancelled, then there is a need for the country to pay some kind of a penalty. And these penalties are so ridiculously high, a lot of countries decide, you know what, it doesn't make any sense. I find that kind of agreement to be illegal. If somebody does something in any way which is somehow contrary to the interests of the country, the normal approach of Western nations is to go to war. Now, why would I sign a contract with an organization which is detrimental to the interests of my nation? And then when a new government comes in, if they were to cancel the contract, doing so would almost impoverish that nation. That, again, for me, is against the interests of the nation. So why is that legally acceptable? I don't get it.
Sometimes I look at laws as a tool that the wealthy use to control people and control nations. And I think some of these agreements are not really worth the paper that they're written on. They're just set in place to ensure, again, as I touched on this in the very beginning, to ensure the post-colonial economic policies are still in place, and large organizations, companies, and governments can continue profiting and exploiting, these poorer countries, or resource-rich poorer countries. And hey, this exploitation doesn't just stop with natural resources. I mean, the appropriation of cultural property as well. I mean, this is something that Western marketeers and organizations still do today. I mean, these are some genius countries that we're looking at. So much good stuff comes out of them, but the people are never credited for their work and ideas.
Sure, I don't know what you think, but we kind of want this is fine. We wanted to have a shorter podcast, and we're nowhere near getting halfway through talking about Burkina Faso. I think we're gonna have to do a second episode on Burkina Faso. What do you think?
Absolutely. I think this is part one, because you and I have only just touched the surface. We've not even spoken about Sankara. We've literally scratched the surface. This could even be a three-parter. I don't know, because I think that Africa, the continent itself, is absolutely amazing. It has so much promise. But this is one country that's very, very special in my opinion. Many people have never heard of it until very, very recent times. I mean, most people hadn't even heard of Upper Volta. Again, Ouagadougou. I mean, it's something I know off the top of my head as a capital country. Most people have never heard of it. And that's not me thinking people are unread and unintelligent. Absolutely. On the contrary, you don't hear much about these countries, but it is a very special place.
Yep, absolutely. I completely agree with you. And I think I'm really happy that even though we've taken the odd journey or the odd pathway away from the main course, we've always come back to the positivity that is, I think, mainly expressed in Burkina Faso history and political history. And Sankara, in these early days, definitely contributed to that level of positivity. So I'm really happy to be able to talk about Burkina Faso again. And then, as you say, maybe this will go into a third episode, because there is a more recent chap who also requires respect, isn't he?
Which I think is it's actually very good, because we've laid the groundwork for our listeners. Part two will be then looking at the implementation and how as successful as that has been. And then, yeah, maybe we can look at how Ibrahim Traore is doing his work in Burkina Faso in part 3 to bring people up to speed. I like the sound of that.
Wonderful, brother. I will always follow that direction that you take, and I'm happy to do so here as well. So thanks a lot. On a Saturday, talking to me as truth. Thanks a lot.
Yes, indeed. Take care.
Two and a mic.